I'm Dana. I'm the Chief Chicken at the Slippy Chicken Company. I'm doing a video today on using woven fabrics made for mermaids, and we're going to be talking about the different finishes that you can use on the raw edge of your seam allowance to get a nice good finish on your garment, and why it's important to sew with your sewing machine rather than with your serger or your overlocker. So first of all, the reason that you need to finish the raw edges of your seam allowance once you've sewn the two pieces of fabric together is because you don't want this to happen. So with a woven fabric, and what you can find is that the warp and the weft will come away from each other and they'll just start to shred along the raw edge of your fabric. With a knit fabric, you're not going to find that happens, so you haven't got to worry about it, but with a woven it will, so you need to finish the raw edge in some way to stop that from happening. The thing to remember when you're sewing your wovens is it's really important to sew the seam first with your normal sewing machine and then finish the raw edge in whatever your preferred version of the finish is. The reason that you have to do that is because if you wanted to just sew the woven fabric together with your overlock or your serger, that kind of 1/4 inch-ish seam allowance that you get left from the serged seam just isn't wide enough for a woven fabric, and what you can find is the warp and the weft fibres will come away from each other along this seam and start to shred. And I've got an example here to show you. So this is a pair of pyjama trousers that I made for myself a while ago, and they were just a really quick afternoon sew, and I just did it, as you can see, using my overlocker, and along that seam it's just come away here at the top. You can see the fibres have just started to pull out from the seam allowance and the whole thing's come apart. So I'm going to have to see if I can fix that somehow at some point, but it serves at the moment just to show what happens if you do just sew with your serger or your overlocker woven fabrics, and that's why you don't want to do that. You want to do one of these. So I'm just going to go through one at a time, talking about what they are and why you'd want to use them. So the first option that we've got here is just using pinking shears. So you sew the seam as normal with your sewing machine, and then along the edge there you're going to trim it with your pinking shears. And what that does is, rather than leaving you long bits of thread that then come away in a stream or a string along the edge, it cuts the warp and the weft threads down at different lengths, and it means you don't get that long string of fibre that comes away. This will last for a certain amount of time. Anything that's going to have an awful lot of wear or an awful lot of wash and wear, you probably find this isn't going to work too well. But for things that are going to have less wash and wear, and for things that might be then enclosed within linings and things, then this is absolutely fine. But you want to sew your seam allowance as normal, and then your pinking goes just along the very edge. You don't want to pink all the way in. You want to pink along the edge, unless you're actually shortening the seam allowance for a specific reason as indicated in the pattern, and you're going to be lining it or something. So just if you were making a pair of pyjama trousers or anything like that, you would sew it like this, and then you would pink along the edge, and that would stop it from coming apart too quickly. The second option is a French seam. A French seam is a traditional couture finish. You often find it with lighter weight fabrics like a silk or a chiffon, something like that, where you're going to have very fine, small French seams. This is obviously a bigger one for demonstration purposes today. And what you do with a French seam is you sew the fabric wrong sides together first. So you would sew it kind of counterintuitively like that, and then you would flip it over on itself, and then you enclose that first seam within a second seam right sides together, so that when you open it up you just have stitching rather than the actual fibre. And the enclosed seam, you can see, is just in here. So the first seam is then enclosed within your second seam. You do sometimes have to widen the seam allowance, add a little bit of extra seam allowance on to make sure you have enough space to be able to do that double seam. But that's a really nice clean finish, and that really does stop things from fraying. That's not going to go anywhere. So that's your French seam. The third option is just doing a zigzag stitch. So you'd sew your seam as normal with your straight stitch on your sewing machine, and then you would do a zigzag stitch just along the raw woven edge here. Again, you want to have a stitch that's fairly densely packed together. You don't want to have them quite far away from each other, because the idea is that these stitches here, as they come off the edge, stop the woven fabric from coming away from the edge there. So you want to make sure that the edge of your zigzag is along the raw edge here. It could take a little bit of practice to get used to, so do a little practice run first, but that's a really nice, easy way of finishing a raw edge of a woven garment. The fourth way is using an overcasting stitch. So just to show you that both ways. So again, you would sew your seam as normal, and then along the raw edge of the fabric you would do an overcasting stitch. So if you have a look in the manual for your sewing machine, it will let you know whether this stitch is available to you. You also need to use an overcasting foot as well, which is designed to run along the raw edge of the fabric, just to make sure this all neatly encloses the edge. And you can see that stitch runs over the side of the raw edge of the fabric, and it stops it from unraveling. So that's your overcasting stitch. And then finally, if you have a serger or an overlocker at home, you can obviously use that for finishing the raw edge of your woven fabric as well. So again, you would sew as normal your straight stitch on your sewing machine, and then you would use your overlocker or your serger just to serge along the raw edge there, just to finish it off and make sure that doesn't come apart. It's a really quick way of finishing things. It's the finish you'll often find in a lot of garments that you buy in shops, because as I say, it's a nice quick way of finishing, and it's a very reliable way of finishing. This isn't going to go anywhere, nothing's going to come apart here. But what you do want to make sure is that you leave the depth there for that seam allowance. You don't want to serge all the way up to here and kind of half this seam allowance, because again, you can find the fibres just start to pull away from the strain of being worn, and it can start to compromise and have holes like I did in the pyjama trousers that I showed you earlier. So those are the 5 finishes that I would tend to use, or that home sewers tend to use. You've got your overlocker, your serger, you've got your overcasting stitch, you have a nice zigzag stitch, you have your lovely professional French seam, and then you have a nice quick and easy pinking shear as well. Hopefully that's given you an idea of the kind of finishes that you can use. Let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully it's been of some use for you today. Okay, thanks very much. Bye bye.